Did you get the handout? Did the handout go out? I mean, send it out. Yeah. And actually, after all of that about the cell phones, it's going to get really crazy now. I actually would like you to turn your cell phones on. I'm not kidding now. Yeah. Especially if you know how to run on your. Is it working? Yeah. If you know how to run the timer on the cell phone, because I need to have as many people as possible put up the amount of time for the lecture, because when the cell phones go off, and it's beautiful if it goes off, they all go off at the same time, making a wonderful music, and I will stop the lecture at the instant we hear the first time. So get out. And then the other thing I'd like you to do, I was giving a reading at Penn State Altoona. I go to all the big venues. And at Penn State Altoona, there were a lot of freshmen there who were forced to come and hear me. And I know you're not in this situation. And so they were freshmen. They were so sweet. I looked up, and they were all looking down. And they don't know that you can actually see them, you know. And so I said, "Are you texting?" And they said, "Well, yeah." I mean, they're freshmen, you know. They don't even lie well. And I said, "Well, I want in on that action." And so today I'm going to do that as well. I'm going to give you my phone number. And as the lecture goes on, if you get bored, I completely expect you to text me, you know, how's it going, you know, what's happening. I'm not good enough yet that while I'm giving the lecture that I'll actually be able to text back to you. But okay, so you got your cell phones on now. That was a covered. Okay, here's my number, 205-310-2932. Yes. 205-310-2932. And I've got a bad plan that's going to cost me like a nickel. So if you're going to do this, make it good. Okay? All right. So now, here's for those of you with your timers, I need, let's see, where are we now? What time is it? It's 1:20 already? Oh, it's 12:20 already? Oh, my God. I need then what? I want to stop at 10 till, so put 30 minutes on the clock. Okay, isn't it beautiful? Isn't it amazing to think that we live in this electromagnetic soup? You know, that these messages are all over here, and we're just holding up these little antennas to draw them back, and it's very strange to think. Okay, and my assistant here, Camille is now, with the lecture that I'm about to give, is actually shuffling things. I have no idea what lecture I'm going to give. She's mixing it up, and we'll go there. Okay, so the handout you have, we may or may not actually get to it. The title of the lecture is Homer on Homer, or, I love that stuff, you know, or a bunch of stuff that happens, and here's the subtitle, and this could be the whole lecture. I mean, the bells could go off soon. An episodic meditation on anecdote, melodrama, twists and turns of fate, surprise endings, gods from the machine, dead horses and shaggy dogs, seasons of television, the turning out, the winding up, the coming to passness, and the picaresque, the point, and the plot. There'll be a test. Okay, here's the first section here. Are you ready? So far you're on to this? You're already texting? Good, great. Blood feud or coagulating nothingness. In The Simpsons, episode 7F22, entitled Blood Feud, Mr. Burns is diagnosed. I mean, this is a university lecture, so you all know The Simpsons, right? I mean, this is okay. Is diagnosed with a deadly condition called hypohemia, leaving him without enough blood to live. Bart has the necessary but extremely rare 00 negative type to provide for life-saving transfusion. Homer, thinking his grateful and now fully recovered boss, Mr. Burns, will reward the gift of his son's blood, is furious when only a polite thank you note is forthcoming. He writes a scathing, vindictive letter to Mr. Burns, who, at first, desires to punish Homer for his impudence, but then comes to his senses, and after an extensive shopping trip at the Springfield Mall, endows the Simpsons at last with a $32,000, 3,000-year-old carved stone head statue of Exatopacapagalo, the Olmec god of war. You remember this one? Later in the episodes, you can actually see the big head in the background. The final scene finds the whole family in the living room on the living room couch eating TV dinners from TV trays, staring at the gigantic head and puzzling out what it all means. Save a guy's life, and what do you get? Homer says. Nothing. Worse than nothing. Just a big, scary rock. Bart says, hey, man, don't badmouth their head. And Marge begins to sum up. It's the thought that counts. The moral of the story is a good deed is its own reward. Hey, we got a reward. The head is cool, says Bart. Well, then, I guess the moral is no good deed goes unrewarded, Marge says. Wait a minute, Homer says. If I hadn't written that nasty letter, we wouldn't have gotten anything. Well, I guess the moral is the squeaky wheel gets the grease, Marge says. But Lisa interrupts. Perhaps there is no moral to this story. Exactly, Homer says. It's just a bunch of stuff that happened. But it certainly was a memorable few days, Marge says. Amen to that, concludes Homer as the credits begin to roll. Homer is on to something there. I live by the narrative pattern in which simply a bunch of stuff happens. For me, that's life. Paradoxically, in this kind of narrative, let's call it serial anecdotery, let's say, in which a bunch of stuff seems to simply randomly happen, nothing actually happens. That is to say, that in our stories, not our anecdotes, our literary stories, we want something to happen even when nothing does happen. There is happen, and then there is happen, isn't there? What is this something that is supposed to happen when we move a simple narrative to a kind of story? Let's call that story of character or a character-driven story to which we all aspire to write and read. Marge, in the above scene, seems to be hinting at it. In the tranquil moment of the reflection upon the emotion-filled last couple of days, bloodshed, tears threatened, gifts granted, she finds it necessary to formulate a moral, a lesson from the preceding proceedings. That is to say, we want our characters who have lived through the events of the stuff that happened to be affected by the stuff that happened, that stuff and the happening of it. They must be transformed by the experience if the experience is going to count, be counted. Indeed, characters in such stories are not just changed by the experience, but what we would argue become who they are by the suffering of such experience. The series of events undergone becomes the crucible. The Greeks call it the agon, the struggle, and that's where we get the word agony. Not only is adjectival character built by suffering of events, but the nominative character, him or herself, becomes a character by weathering the action of events. Stuff happens to them. But the humor in the Simpsons' living room is derived from Marge's inability to make sense of what has happened in the reality of that fiction. It is a satire of what we ask our stories to do. Her desire is to impose meaning. The desire of storytelling is thwarted by the logic of her son and husband's niggling critiques of her insights and by her daughter's existential interpolation that, in fact, there is nothing to be learned here. Nothing but perhaps nothingness of life or life's nothingness, precocious little Lisa. Nothing happens, to borrow from Auden. Do you know that poem? He says, poetry makes nothing happen, or a kind of nothing can happen in poetry and in storytelling. But life, real life, that life may be in fact different from the life in fiction. Nothing is simply nothing. Real life is where we believe and where we fear a bunch of stuff merely happens. Happens in life. And the Marge in all of us puts the best face on the defeat of aesthetic order and epiphany in the face of this random and familiar chaos in which we live. It certainly was, she says, a memorable few days, and we all say amen to that. Okay, so far, not too bad. It really is nice with the text thing. You know, you get bored, and I have these little sections. I'll be moving on, you know, so you can check out for a while. Another nothing. The television series, we're staying with TV. The television series Seinfeld is, even now as it strips its episodes in daily and multi-station reruns, celebrated for its innovative formula that it is a show about nothing. The show even parodied the notion when George and Jerry, desperate to come up with a story to sell to television on television, pitched a show very much like the show they were in, also about nothing. But the notion that television show about nothing would be something new and different from all other television shows is not true. Or to be more exact, all television series are always already about nothing. That is to say, they are melodramatic. Things happen to the characters during the hour, the half hour, but the things that happen to the characters do not significantly impact on the nature of the character. You name them: Will and Grace, Hawkeye and Trapper, Sergeant Saunders and Lieutenant Hanley, the Professor and Mary Ann, Starsky and Hutch, Rory and Lorelei, Tony and Carmela, Siskel and Ebert. No, wait, that's a different kind of show. Ross and Rachel. Things happen to them, but nothing that happens to them changes them in any appreciable way. That's the nothing that happens. All the death and suffering witnessed in Korea or in the OR of MASH leaves at the end of the evening's episode a Hawkeye pretty much like the Hawkeye we discovered at the beginning of the show. The death, the desire, the suffering, the meanness, the love found in any televised OR or courtroom or bedroom or battlefront or boardroom or Mean Street leaves at last no mark on its participants. No, it wasn't nothing that the writers of Seinfeld invented. This kind of nothing is what television is always about. This is why we watch it. This is why we watch. And it's why I watch, not for its character development, but for the character's stabilities, their resilience, and their resistance to change. Nothing happens to the character while around them everything is happening. Things, not people, are in flux. And it is the flux that attracts us, the adventure, the twist, the turn, the pure plot, the coincidence. Larry David's true innovation to the form was his stated and professed dictum that there be in his situation comedy, in his melodrama, this is what he said: no hugging, no learning. No hugging, no learning. He identified and eliminated from Seinfeld the convention of the genre at about 10 minutes from the episode's conclusion to have the characters see something, or forgive, or come to realize, or make a gesture indicative of an authentic epiphany or change. David recognized this moment for the sham it is in the form he was working. It is the sop that the story of plot makes to another kind of story, the story of character, and he'd have none of it. All right. Vehicular vehicles. This is great. There's a coincidence here. I've mixed up, or somehow there's a part here, an extra page that I thought was part of the one, but it's actually from another one, so I didn't read that. Vehicular vehicles. A definition of coincidence is the occupation of the same area of space or happening at the same time. A while ago, I totaled my car in an accident at the intersection of Paul W. Bryant Boulevard and 23rd Avenue in Tuscaloosa. I am okay, but the airbags in my 1996 Honda deployed, filling the cabin with foul-smelling powder I mistook for smoke from a fire. The bags are packed in cornstarch so that they won't stick when folded up. Anybody pop their airbags? You do. You think you're on fire. As I plowed into the white late-model Buick that had run a stop sign and was suddenly in front of me. The day before, my son, Sam, had gotten his license and had driven that night his first solo and uneventful mission in this now very totaled automobile. A delicious irony is all he says when I tell him he no longer has his ride. This isn't my first automobile accident. My life in high school is a series of accidents. Life in high school, perhaps, is a series of accidents. Life itself is perhaps a series of accidents. In high school, attempting to make a left-hand turn, I watched a car skid into me. I watched it in the mirror and had enough time to think, hold on, before I was hit. Again in high school, I pirouetted at 70 miles an hour on a patch of black ice near Marion, Indiana on I-69. And again in high school, I was able to destroy both my family cars simultaneously when, while shifting the Camaro into drive, I got stuck in reverse and slammed into the Cutlass parked behind me. Teaching the narrative essay to my freshman comp English class years ago at Iowa State University, I had to issue a blanket prohibition on the subject. No writing about one's car accidents. There were so many, and my students took, I think, these dramatic coincidences as a natural occasion to retell, primed for narrative treatment, a story ready to be told. Is this true in your case? Got a lot of stories told about your car wrecks? But in most cases, in cases that even involved a death or deaths, the experience had not really altered the world of its narrator in any meaningful way. Their accidents, reconstructed in such loving and exact details, had not engendered any profound change in their behaviors, had not led them to a conscious altering revelation about the meaning of life or death. It had not even stopped them from hopping into the next car to come along, take off down the same tragic and now morbidly attractive, compelling, dangerous section road of their recent mishap. Thinking about the accident, or more precisely, the writing about that accident, if it did anything at all to their psyches, only conjured within them the cool sensation of the event, the rush of dumb luck. Their lives, by virtue of accident, became interesting. But the accident was not a propellant into a different plane or altered state. I drive a new car bought by my insurance money. I noticed I am still skittish at intersections, and the accident makes for a good anecdote. The detail about the cornstarch in the airbags is a particularly attractive embellishment, I believe. A wreck feels like it should be the vehicle to some climactic revelation. And who knows? Perhaps things have been set in motion in my life by that coincidence of two cars inhabiting the same space and time. It would be a very good story, but I would need to imagine the true vectors of that collision, the physics of coincidence, or of the physics of consequence and not coincidence. So what's next? A nonsense of an ending. Nick is my 10-year-old son, and he is scared to death by death. He is at that stage. This fall, as the sun goes down each night, the color drains from his face, and he races to the bathroom to kneel by the toilet, waiting to throw up. I go in after him and sit on the floor next to him while he, hunched over, concentrates on the cramps of his own body. Waiting, he says, "It's not fair." And I say, "No, it's not." I imagine this death sickness is perhaps chemical, sparked by his own dawning hormonal changes. He is losing his baby fat, his teeth have fallen out or growing back. My recent car accident contributes to this fear. I ask him about that, and he nods quickly, suppressing another wave of what? Existential ennui, nausea until death. Poor kid. What can I say to him? On the floor, waiting as time passes, I think about Thomas Aquinas. That really helped Nick. I consider telling Nick about how the saint came up with his own accommodation with this drama. Death is an ending to the story, he reasoned. Death exists to give meaning to our life. Without death, God and ourselves would have no distance, no place to regard the course of events in order to make judgments. Without death, life would truly be a bunch of stuff that happened. I think better of sharing this insight with Nick while he is engaged in his struggle with his own reality of life becoming real to him. It also seems rather lame now in the cold light of that bathroom. A similar problem has emerged in my current nonfiction writing workshop as my students struggle with their narrative memoirs. Their lives do not lack for drama. There is plenty of drama to go around, car wrecks for one. What they do lack is an ending. They are in the middle of things. The solution, of course, is to construct an artificial coda, an artificial ending, to draw an arbitrary parentheses around a particular period of life. Childhood, say, or my junior year abroad, bound moments that can and now be appreciated. Isn't that true of memoirs? I mean, you're writing memoirs and it's about your life, but you don't know what your life's about really, and so you have to find within your life the deaths you've already experienced, the end of your teenage years, the end of your salad days, and then you can actually look back and make sense of it. We need that ending. Thomas Aquinas' writing, by the way, has never been completely collected. This is an interesting aside. I'm all about the aside. Aquinas was a Dominican monk. He wrote lectures, gave them like this, and then placed them in the library for students to take out and to copy. There's a team of, honest to God, this is true. There's a team of Dominican monks living in a Benedictine monastery in Switzerland right now, hard at recovering the text closest to the master's own hand. The richer Benedictines, the work of their patron Bernard safely collected, make fun of the prodigal and tardy Dominicans as they labor away. They are like a Mission Impossible squad. They are experts in arcane fields of handwriting, Latin, paper, ink. They have been patiently working back through the extant manuscripts, back through time, back to the words closest to St. Thomas's hand, maybe even discover a remnant of the actual Thomistic draft. Recently, the team, all in their late 60s, came to a conclusion. They were running out of time. They realized they would not live long enough to complete the work. So they decided to stop with the end of their stories, stop with the end of their story in sight, both their own life stories and the story of their lives. They stopped and started another narrative, and they recruited a new batch of acolytes, younger monks, to work and complete the work. They began again, turning away from the ancient texts, the end almost in sight, to the texts they contained, teaching this next generation of what they knew of Latin, ink, paper, and writing. Sad, isn't it? Those poor monks. Beating dead horses, or no more corners to turn. There is a moment in the movie version of Gone with the Wind. Have you seen Gone with the Wind? It is after all the melodrama of the courtships and marriage. It is after the start of the Civil War, the flight from Tara, after the birthing of the babies, the burning of Atlanta. In fact, there's Atlanta burning in the background right now. After the famous crane shot of the dead and dying in the rail yard, the endless field burned into your mind. Scarlet, backlit, is beating it out of town. She's beating a pony or a mule or something, fleeing in a cart, then suddenly beating the pony, donkey, mule, just stone cold collapses, dead under the whip. Scarlet really goes on beating the dead horse, the heap of the dead horse at her feet. It is, well, the final straw for the horse, for sure. But for me, the viewer also, the reversals of plot have taken one too many turns. Both horse and story collapse under the weight of the burden to haul and make stuff happen. When I visit Atlanta today, I love to include a visit to Grant Park in the Cyclorama. Have you been to the Cyclorama? The panoramic painting of the 1864 Battle of Atlanta. It is made of heavy-gauge cotton duck canvas. It's 42 feet high and 358 feet in circumference, as it is a 9,000-pound painting wrapped around into a perfect circle. To view the endless rendition of the Battle of Atlanta, you enter through the floor, and within the ring, you work and walk your way around the course of the inner circle, animating the battle in front of you. It is easy to follow the full circle, to loop and loop and loop the endless battle. It starts and stops and blooms and decay. It builds and ruins. the constant and continuous real. The phoenix rising from the flames is the seal of the city of Atlanta. The painting also enacts that narrative and recaps the South's unique historical sense of the never-ending ending. As Faulkner says about the South, the past ain't over. Hell, it ain't even past. There is the desire in some prose writers to resist the vector of plot, to cut corners of the ever-onward arrowhead. The desire is shared by poets who have confronted the forward motion of language and invented some formal solutions. Through brevity, repetition, they create an illusion of the endless ending. Prose, too, with episode, picaresque, melodrama, draws a stay against the inevitable and suggests an endlessness. Not only an end to the endings, but an end to end it all, and the end to beginnings, middles, and ends. Do you know the writer John Barth? Have you ever read anything by John Barth? He has a book called Lost in the Funhouse, and he offers an ultimately sort of tricky story that has a funny ending. The reader is asked, and you could maybe do this if you wanted to do it, you could take out a strip right from the book. You're supposed to rip out a strip of paper, and on that strip of paper, on both sides, there's written this. This is once upon a time, a story began. That's what's written. And so what you do with that strip of paper is that you make a Mobius strip. You know what that is? You twist it, and then you connect it to its front. And a Mobius strip is a geographic or geometrical solid that has no inside or outside. And so you continually read the story. Once upon a time, there was a story that began. Once upon a time, there was a story that began. So it's a really it's a tricky story, clever little story, but it is it's an attempt to have an endless ending, or an endless ending. This is a story poem as incantation, an incantation against the deadbeat horse. The drama of the circle versus the hard line. A dead horse walking. What is around the corner is another corner. The plot twist is the plot, not merely the switch in the hand of the driven mule driver. How are we doing? Were we hearing any musical tones? Not yet, not yet. Oh, but it's exciting, isn't it? Notice how I built the tension up. That's called suspense in your narrative, your narrative vocabulary. Wait, it gets better. The original Shaggy-Dog Story, have you heard that term, the Shaggy-Dog Story? There was an original Shaggy-Dog Story. And it isn't that old, apparently. It was invented in the 1930s. Was about a shaggy dog. Who knew? This kind of long-winded narrative features a string of typical irrelevant incidents that usually concludes with a pointless or absurd punchline. Also known as yarns, the Shaggy-Dog Story springs from the oral roots of storytelling, campfire tales, and conversational anecdotes. The canonical Shaggy-Dog Story centers on a talking shaggy dog, much discussed and much promised, but slow to appear in the story. When the dog at last arrives and, in fact, talks, the response is that dog is not so shaggy. In The School by Donald Barthelme, do you know that story? Have anybody read The School by Donald Barthelme? Donald Barthelme applies the form to a story narrated by an elementary school teacher who recounts with ever-increasing degree and occasions in which death has visited his classroom. It's a second-grade classroom. Beginning with the Arbor Day trees that die by overwatering and continue with the goldfish, the salamander, the puppy, and even the adopted Save the Child Overseas orphan, it then escalates to an extraordinary number, quote, an extraordinary number of parents passing away, 2 heart attacks and 2 suicides, 1 drowning, 4 killed together in a car accident, 1 stroke, and we had the usual heavy mortality rate among the grandparents, unquote. It doesn't end there. Of course, 2 students are killed, we are told, at a construction site, and the litany at last ends with, quote, I forgot to mention Billy Brandt's father, who was knifed fatally when he grappled with a masked intruder in his home, unquote. The rehearsal of this series of tragedies leads to a class discussion that results in the concerned second graders, citing St. Thomas Aquinas, demand their teacher make love right there and now with Helen, his teaching assistant. Quote, Please, please, make love with Helen. We require an assertion of value. We are frightened, say the second graders. The teacher gives in and goes, as does Helen, and quote, I kissed her a few times on the brow. We held each other. The children were excited. Then there was a knock on the door. I opened the door, and the new gerbil walked in. The children cheered wildly, unquote. The story is very funny, and funny in the face of horror, the farce of death. Indeed, the funniest parts are of the piling on, the sheer invention of the variety of dying. I read The School, too, as a story about the reality of implausibility, the reality of accident, the surprise in how such occurrences operate in our lives, and stories about our lives. At issue is the technical definition of tragedy as the aesthetic category. Perhaps the fatal flaw of the Aristotelian tragedy is its insistence upon the fatal flaw. That is to say, we look to a character's action to describe authentic emotion as well as to generate believable metamorphosis in the circumstances. But Barthelme parodies such a standard, delivering pathos for the tragos. Few of us in life or in the stories of our lives are heroes. And the bad keeps happening. Stories and styles of storytelling that place their characters at the whim of chance or at the mercy of events still work for us. They deliver an emotional wallop, albeit a wholly different kind of wallop. Ooh, the GI tract considered as a metaphor for narrative. Each semester, I have my students publish their own work by creating, and that's what's so great here, you guys are publishing things. Each semester, I have my students publish their own work by creating actual books in which to print their stories. Most keep Kinkos pretty busy, producing simple saddle or spiral-stitched booklets. But the task of making a book renders for some a loose interpretation of what that means. I like it when the content of the book and the book itself become organically formal. Like the one woman who wrote a series of sonnets about different cuts of meat and bound the work in a meat red wrapper, and then she had the book shrink-wrapped by the butcher at the Piggly Wiggly. Another student wrote a story about a compulsively clean man who swallowed a long strip of indigestible cloth in order to, well, floss his entire GI tract. The book of that story arrived in my office as a very, very long winding of sized cloth upon which the story was printed as one very long line. I must say I did like the organic connection, the metaphor of swallowing the story, rumination, digestion, etc. It gets you thinking about the other metaphors we use for storytelling, yarns and threads, the notions of narration. Was that a bell? Is that it? Is that it? Is time up? No. Or is that just somebody calling you? That's it for the lecture. Okay, 5 minutes? Then all of you are going to have to sing in 5 minutes. That's right. It also tells you how arbitrary time is. I'll just go off script here. Do you know the little time ball in Times Square on New Year's Eve? You've all been watching that? What the hell is that thing? Really? I mean, now it's Tiffany crystal. Does anybody know what that thing is? Why it's there? Anybody know? Yeah. My God, you're brilliant. That's hardly anybody knows. In 1883, before 1883, every town had a different time. And it was based on the zenith, when the sun was straight overhead, the zenith of that day. And so, let's see, you here are on Central Time, and so because they standardized time, you actually are on Memphis time, because that's the zenith for standard time. And the railroads did that because their schedules were all screwed. Can you imagine? Railroads, imposing time. The government had nothing to do with it. They imposed time. We're still working with railroad time. But before 1883, all cities had a time ball on top of the tallest building in town, and around noon, you would go out and you would look at the time ball as it came down and, set your clock. Isn't it amazing? Humans, I tell you. And so now, of course, no one wears watches anymore because it's all, Well, you're old school. So how much time did I kill on that one? Yeah, and it's the New York thing. That's the last remaining one. But they used to be all over every place. Okay, where did I end up here? Very long. I must say, one line follow. There is no way around the order. That's just the way it is. The words themselves line up. They align. We seek ways to be more or less organically deflect, curve, or contour the path through time and space, but they connect, as though they are worsted or twisted. The story of Ariadne, Ariadne, I'm just throwing out all these names, you guys know all this stuff, is the story of a thread and the thread of the story. Ariadne was Theseus' lover. He was in the maze, and she gave him the thread that he took into the maze that he could follow out. Clue, here's another thing. Oh, you're going to be great at the cocktail parties later. Oh, yes, a time ball is But clue, C-L-U-E, right? A clue for a story. A clue, by the way, is derived from the word clue, C-L-E-W, right? And that is, anybody know what a clue, C-L-E-W is? It's a ball of yarn. The clue, the ball of yarn that Theseus used in the labyrinth. The way in is the way out. Remember, this is the guy with the 30-foot long. That's how long your intestine is. Oh, and by the way, I'll end really on a public service announcement. How many of you have had your colonoscopies? Honest to God, you got it. I know. You young folks here, you don't have to really worry about it till you're 40. But if you have cancer in your family, be sure to start this thing. Honest, it's great. It's just a bad rap because of this particular drug. The drug, Versed. How many of you have had Versed? Unbelievable. The drug is an amnesiac. So when you have your colonoscopy, you are completely conscious. They need to keep you awake because they got to talk to you, but you don't remember. Isn't that a great drug? And it has things for our subject matter as well. When I had my first colonoscopy, I go all the time now. I love it. When I had my first one, my son Nick, the nervous little Nick, I woke up and he said, I said to him, they had a red Sears toolbox, automotive toolbox in the operating room, and my nurse's name was Linda Evans. That's what I said when I came to it. And he looked right at me. He said, "Dad, you've told me that 10 times." Because Versed doesn't let you remember what it is you said. It's like your hard drive hasn't rebooted yet. And it was finally after 10 times that I remembered that I had said that. So you got to get the Versed. It's great. So now we've exhausted time. Is there time for some questions? You got any questions about all of this? It's now all completely clear? Yeah. How many more we got? 5 more. We got 5.
I mean, do you just write lectures all the time?
These little things? Yeah, I write all the time. Yeah. And I like to think, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that I'm informative always. So.
Question back there.
Yeah. Wait a minute, I'm not seeing. Oh, you're there. Okay. Yeah, pretty much. Or I'm thinking about it all the time too. And I write in these very short bursts. Taking the plane out here. I'm a big fan. Again, I'm old school. I really love postcards. And so on the plane out here, I wrote 15 postcards on each leg, and I still have to mail them. But I mean, I like just those little sorts of things, and I think it has to do with having children. You know, when you're starting out as a writer, you think, oh, you know, I'm going to write 2 hours a day, and I'm going to have this pristine, sort of clear place. You know, so the kid goes down, and I got to get stuff down on paper because you got to work in the seams. You know. Yeah. What made me become a writer? I'll give you the short version of a long story. It had to do with a cheerleader. Her name was Janine. I grew up in Indiana. Basketball is a big deal. I lettered in speech and debate. I would go with Janine through the fall, and you know, then she would break up with me to start going with Tom Shaley, the power forward, until we got eliminated in the sectionals. And then that was after, or right before her birthday usually, and then I'd get back together with her, and that happened like for 3 years. I was a total idiot. But in the downtime, when she was going with Tom Shaley, the power forward, I would write, you know, and part of what I was writing was like Tom Shaley, the power forward, in his really good-looking Trans Am would be going over cliffs, dying. I mean, that's the amazing thing about writing, is that you can imagine other things, you know, and I think after a while, I became more interested in the manipulation of the world around me as opposed to actually trying to get Janine to like me. She's all okay now. She's an actuary. She lives in Chicago. She's making tons of money. So that's how I started, really. I mean, it was in high school, and it was a response. It was a response to, you know, very, very simple and ancient thing. Pardon? I do. I thank her all the time. She doesn't like it when I go through Chicago and I give her a call, but nor does her husband Tom. But pardon? You got nothing, huh? Well, here I think it can be simply sort of reduced to this: that we live in actually a kind of life that we like to call melodramatic. You know, that things happen to us, but it doesn't really change us. But when you read a story, in fact, if you think of fairy tales, there's always a little formula in fairy tales. There's the once upon a time part, which is what life is. Once upon a time, you know, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. But there's that other little phrase in a story. And it's not, they lived happily after ever. It's this other little phrase. You know what it is? Anybody? One day. You know, so once upon a time, there was an evil queen. She had this mirror, right? She had this mirror, and the mirror says, you're the fairest in the land. And she also had this stepdaughter who was in the scullery, and she was Snow White, and she was beautiful and all of that. That can go on and go on and go on until the one day of the story. What's the one day of the Snow White story? What? One day, the mirror says, hey, you're not the fairest. What the hell? It was a Thursday. I mean, did Snow White all of a sudden grow one more cell on her beautiful cheek? Did she grow one more eyelash that made her beautiful? And then, oh no, that is the complete arbitrary reason that a story is a story, is because it wants to get the narrative in motion, because it's going to lead somewhere important and crucial. But in fact, we live in a world that has these two different ways of arranging stuff that happens. One has to do with and that's your little handout, with a kind of rising action and change. Another has to do, and you see it down there in the microscope, another has to do with a bunch of stuff that happens but sort of goes nowhere. And in the argument, we like to think that the stuff that goes someplace is actually better. But in fact, the other type, the melodramatic type, even though that has a bad rap, we really enjoy and we get stuff from. So that was the point. And so what I was trying to do was to actually sort of replicate that here in the lecture. That it was going to go all over, a bunch of stuff that was going to happen. It was going to be entertaining. It perhaps finally doesn't mean anything in the other sense, where I have a point I was driving to. That wasn't very short, but does that help? See, either you wasted... So I guess what I'm saying is that you wasted this whole hour, but you did so in an interesting way. Or that was the hope. Yeah. Yes. I think I demonstrated that. But that is an it's an interesting, randomness is interesting, isn't it? I mean, because, there was a group of writers and artists in the 1920s after World War I, when everybody, here was great logic, rationalist Europe killing each other in the millions. And that really shook up a lot of people. Why, we thought we were so smart, so intellectual, we had this all under control, and then we let loose in this completely chaotic, awful way. And the response of the artists after World War I was to sort of investigate randomness. And one thing they discovered, the Dadists, one of the things they did is they took a Shakespeare sonnet and they cut it up into the individual words, and they put it into Camille's hat, and then they pulled it out one word at a time and put it back together. It was complete nonsense. But the interesting thing that happens is that we will still make sense of it. That you can be as random and as crazy as possible, but you'll find the pattern in it. You'll see connections and juxtapositions that make sense or do other work. So yes, I like to act randomly, but sometimes it is impossible for us to act truly randomly. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. Yes. What? I didn't hear.
Is that really your phone?
Yeah. My phone. I hope so. My phone's in my bag in the other room, but I will text you back. I know. Yeah. Oh, we got
A couple more questions.
Pardon? I'm sorry. I often outline. I think it's funny, isn't it? You do interviews, or you read interviews of writers, and I just blame Hemingway for this. Hemingway was so sure that all of his little peculiarities and weirdnesses, were the way you should write. And I think it is everybody's way of writing, I think, is finally the best way to write, because you yourself discover that process. But Hemingway said, you had to have 5 pencils sharpened, and you write 250 words, and all of that. I did an anthology called Rules of Thumb, where I asked 70-some writers to give me your rule of thumb, and they're quite sure this is the way you should do it, but they're constantly contradicting each other, and that's what's so great about writing, is that as opposed to being another kind of artist, is all you need is a piece of paper and some kind of writing tool, and you are in business, as opposed to like a studio with a huge thing. So, well, one more
question.
Yeah. 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 Yes. The denouement. Again, at the cocktail party tonight, you could say, yes, there is the denouement, which is the C to the D is the denouement. Yeah. Well, I think they both happen. That the little picture there is that part A to B is the ground situation. And you can actually extend then, you can extend from B, keep it going straight on the top one, and see the line D from E. The difference between that lower line and that one is, in a usual story, what we say happened. Where something ends here, this is how it differs from the beginning of the story. That's what but the lower one is, what if you take away the rising action and all of that, and you're just concentrating on that A to B line? And what you have actually is a pattern of what what you would call the melodrama. And so the classic melodrama would be Odysseus. I mean, think about it. Odysseus has been gone 20 years, right? He's been fighting in war. He's lost his whole crew coming back. He's now come home, or he's slept around. I mean, he's gone off with the sirens. He has literally been to hell and back twice in the narrative. So all this stuff happens. But the beginning of the Odyssey, you remember, right? Again, at the cocktail party. Oh, yes, the beginning of the Odyssey this is a story about a man who is never at a loss. And at the end of the story, Odysseus is a man who is never at a loss. So all this stuff happens to him up and down, but it doesn't lead any place in the way the other story leads. See, so that's, and so but still, we like to read the Odyssey. We like to watch TV. So
I have some bad news for
we got to go.
We're all done, but the good news is you have his cell phone number. So you want to keep
True.
this up, just keep it ringing. So let's thank Michael Martone.
Thank you. Thank you.